Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Accelerating Contract Grazing in Illinois with Mallory Krieger and Brett Mathews. I'm Jane Jordan. I'll be your MC for today's call. I'm a program associate with the Pasture Project at the Wall Center, and I am based in Chicago. So to start us off, I'm going to go through some logistics for the call, and then I'll talk briefly about the Pasture Project. We'll do some audience polling, and then after that, we'll get into presentations from first Mallory and then Brett, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. Mallory is going to start by laying out some big picture context for grazing in Illinois, focusing on some of the work that she's led with the Illinois statewide regenerative grazing working group. I'll then do a brief intro of the Midwest Grazing Exchange, which we see as a key tool to increase grazing and access to forage in the state. And then Brett will talk specifically about his experience as a landowner and grazier on the exchange. So we're going to start kind of big macro scale and then zoom into what all of this looks like on the farm level. In terms of Zoom technology, pretty self-explanatory. Feel free to throw questions and comments in the chat. I'll just ask that everyone stays on mute during the presentations, and we'll have some time at the end for discussion where you can unmute and ask questions. And if you have any tech issues, let us know in the chat, and we'll do our best to help you out. We've all spent probably many hours on Zoom, but still there are Zoom curveballs, so we'll try and help you out if you have issues. There is a call-in number in the meeting invite if you need to join via phone. Folks calling in will have more limited functionality, won't be able to participate in polls or access the chat, but you can still unmute at the end and ask questions. And we're going to hold off on answering questions until the end, so we make sure we get through all of the presentations. But like I said, feel free to drop questions in the chat and as the speakers present so you don't lose them. And then last point on logistics, we're recording the webinar today, and it will be available on the Pasture Project website in the coming week with all the slide decks and relevant links. So you can check back to our site for the recording. All right, so let's do some intros. So Pasture Project is hosting this webinar. Pasture Project is an initiative of the Wallace Center at Winrock International. And Pasture Project works to advance and integrate regenerative grazing as a scalable, market-driven solution for building healthy soil, viable farms, and resilient communities in the upper Midwest. Although we increasingly are working more nationally on issues related to regenerative ag. The Pasture Project is one of numerous Wallace Center projects that we view as central to our realizing our mission for food and farming, which is that all communities have the power to nourish themselves and regenerate ecosystems through just food and agriculture systems. At the heart of those systems are dynamic networks of people connected through interdependent relationships with each other and the land. And I think that theme of connectivity and relationships will hopefully come through in the presentations today. So please check out our website, pastureproject.com or .org, and subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date on our work. We have some exciting things coming up, including an online grazing planning course that will launch in April. So stay tuned for more on that. So I'm gonna actually introduce Mallory as our first speaker to give us that kind of macro picture of grazing Illinois. So Mallory Krieger is a regenerative ag organizer and educator. Through her consulting business, Terra Olosa, she provides project management support to organic and regenerative ag organizations throughout the Midwest. She currently serves as the Illinois organizer for the Pasture Project, as a member of the Embra Grazing Partnership, and as the National Program Director for OATS, which is the Organic Agronomy Training Service. For the past 3 years, Mallory has led statewide efforts to increase the adoption of regenerative grazing practices in Illinois. So over to you, Mallory.
Thanks so much, Jane. It's wonderful to see everyone on the call today, some familiar faces and some new names, which is always exciting to be able to connect with people that I haven't met before. I do want to just give a real quick disclosure that my computer has a slight glitch in it, and you might see a little bit of a grid popping up at the top of your screen while I'm sharing. I hope it's not too distracting, and thank you for tolerating it. I'm still trying to figure out why that is happening. But as Jane said, I am Mallory Krieger. I am the Illinois organizer with the Pasture Project. I serve as a contractor with them. And I also am a member of the Embra Grazing Partnership, and I've been helping quite a bit with setting up the Illinois Grazing Lands Coalition in kind of their new push to organize around regenerative grazing in the state. So I'm doing a lot of work behind the scenes, but I myself am an aspiring grazer. I don't have cattle yet, but my brother is actually outside right now at my farm putting in posts for our fences. So we are on our way to getting cattle. So I am here to talk about the roadmap for expanding regenerative grazing in Illinois. And this is a document that was written over the course of about a year and a half, starting in the fall of 2019 and finishing in the spring of 2020. And it is a document that is intended to help coordinate efforts in Illinois to get more acres under regenerative grazing management. So this document was written by a group of stakeholders throughout Illinois. We had grazers, we had government employees, we had nonprofit workers, and extension, university personnel. So we had a good mix of stakeholders come together to write this roadmap, and our core group is written here on the screen. The first thing we did in writing this roadmap was to set a definition of regenerative grazing that we could work from as a group that we could all agree with. This definition was compiled through a series of interviews, in-depth interviews that were done with grazers throughout the state, as well as several in-person meetings that were conducted ahead of writing the roadmap. And so we gathered a lot of information about how people were using the term regenerative grazing and synthesized it into this definition. So when we say regenerative grazing in this roadmap, we mean a principle-driven farming practice of building soil health naturally through pasturing animals on perennial and annual forages and grasses with low or no synthetic inputs in a way that supports human and ecosystem health, farm profitability, and community and food system resilience. So we really tried to capture that we're using farming practices that are livestock based to build soil health in a natural way, in a way that supports all three tiers of sustainability: the social side, the economic side, and the environmental side. So in writing this roadmap, the first place that we started was to get an idea of the current state of agriculture and particularly grazing here in Illinois. And we all know Illinois is known as the prairie state, but when we drive the highways of the state, we don't really see much prairie anymore. But back in the 1840s, 60% of the land area of Illinois was prairie lands, highly diverse ecosystems, lots of biological diversity, and a really integrated soil health building ecosystem integrated between herds of ruminants that roamed the prairie and fires that burned the prairie and the diverse vegetation that would come back up. The remaining 40% of the land area in the 1840s was made up of primarily forest, water, and wetlands, and some small area of settlements. Today, that prairie ecology has given way to 16.2 million acres of two species, corn and soybeans, which places Illinois as the second place ranking as an agricultural commodity producer in the US. So 60% of the land used to be prairie, 60% of the land now is just corn and soybeans. 15% is dedicated to livestock and specialty crop production. So that's 75% of the land area is dedicated to agricultural activity in Illinois now. Only 0.1% of that original prairie still exists. The remaining land area, 25%, is made up of cities, water, forests, and grasslands. So we've lost considerable amount of our forests and grasslands in the state, and almost the entirety of the prairie. So from an agricultural perspective, we are also losing farm operators in Illinois. In 1959, we had 164,000 individual farm operators in the state. In 2019, that number had dropped by more than half to 75,087. As I said before, we are the #2 producer for corn and soybeans in the nation. Good news is that 22% of Illinois farms still have beef cattle as part of the production. That equates to 16,000 cattle operations in Illinois. The sad part is that only 179 of those operations are grass finished producers. The remainder are stocker operations or cow-calf operations that don't raise out to finish, sell into the feedlot pipeline, and then also feedlots. So of those grass finished producers, you can see a map here on the screen that shows the distribution of them. And you can see that the grass finished producers are clustered mainly in the north of the state, as well as the north central portion of the state. Western Illinois and Southern Illinois are traditionally known as cattle grazing country. There are a lot of cattle operations in those areas. We just don't see many grass finished operations in those areas. So the good news though, is that the current value of grass finished beef in Illinois is growing. It's currently, as of 2019, estimated to be $15 to $27.5 million in consumer value produced. Nationally, grass-fed beef sales are increasing from 2018 to 2019. In just that 1 year span, we saw a 10% increase in demand for grass-finished beef. But the sector is still small. Even though it's growing, it is just 4% of the total beef industry in the United States. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic period has altered these numbers. I do not have access to those numbers, but anecdotally, what I've been hearing from grass-finished producers throughout the state is that they saw a significant increase in demand from their direct-to-consumer market channels, but they saw a significant increase in difficulty with processing and getting their beef to market. So a little bit more on the economic side, transitioning from continuous to regenerative grazing has been shown to increase farm net revenue by $100 per acre. That is achieved both from receiving a premium for the grass finished designation, but it's also achieved by decreasing input expenses. So regenerative grazers typically spend less on hay, fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, other chemical inputs, manure management, and infrastructure. We see that regenerative grazing is particularly impactful for profitability on highly erodible soils, where the cropping on those soils would be low productivity and therefore low profitability. With regenerative grazing, it can protect those highly erodible soils and also see significant revenue returns there. A 2020 study of 15 Wisconsin-based grass-fed beef farms showed an average annual return of $135 per acre. And that is within 10% of row crop averages for that area, showing that grass-fed farms can be, on a profitability scale side, competitive with row crop returns. Further, regeneratively grazing cover crops can also bring added revenues to farms, increasing overall profitability. A 3-year study from Minnesota and Iowa found that grazing cover crops regeneratively netted a return of an average of $123 per acre. And that is just added revenue on top of the row crop rotation by capturing revenue, forage revenue off of the cover crops. So the roadmap, given that context, the working group set out a goal to write a roadmap that would lay out recommendations that if we achieve those recommendations, we would see an increase in the number of acres of regenerative managed land in Illinois. And so we set a goal, or a target rather, of converting 40,000 acres of Illinois farmland to regenerative grazing management by 2025. That number is how many acres would be needed to meet the projected increase in demand for Illinois grass-fed beef. So we want Illinois beef products to meet the projected increase in demand for Illinois consumers. And it would take 40,000 acres by 2025 to meet that increased demand. So we set about writing the roadmap. This screen shows you the different sections of the roadmap. We talk about the history of Illinois regenerative grazing, take a snapshot of Illinois agriculture today, talk about why regenerative grazing is the solution. I've laid out for you today a lot of the profitability reasons, but the roadmap also goes into the ecological and environmental reasons. There are many, many benefits that regenerative grazing has for water quality and soil health, and the reduction of erosion on working lands. Then we go through some of the challenges to implementation of regenerative grazing, look at some of the opportunities, and then we bring it all together with a list of 9 recommendations. Our goal with this roadmap is that producers such as yourselves and nonprofit educators and universities and industry members, all sectors of the agriculture economy in Illinois, can see a place where they can individually plug into these recommendations and therefore be a part of bringing about the conversion of acres to regenerative grazing. So let's go through these. The first recommendation is to develop a consistent definitions, practices, and quality standards for grass-based beef that emphasize regenerative practices. There are many definitions of regenerative and many different definitions of regenerative grazing that are in use. And we, as a working group, felt that it was important that we were all on the same page. The second is to develop a formal training program for technical assistance providers. This recommendation, I'm happy to report, has had work done over the last 1.5 years toward it. The Ember Grazing Partnership, which is a group based in East Central Illinois, has been holding technical assistance provider trainings on regenerative grazing and will be also holding several of those this summer and winter as well. The Pasture Project has also created an online curriculum and run a cohort of educators through that program this summer as well. Our third recommendation is to support more direct farmer education activities. I'm also very happy to report that through the work that we have done with this roadmap and with stakeholder building activities, we have seen several organizations take up the call and host webinars and host field days directed toward farmer education on regenerative grazing activities. But we also need much more of this. There are more grazers out there who have many different educational needs, and we'd love to see more activity in that. Recommendations 4 through 8 we have had limited engagement with so far. These are areas that we would really like to see other organizations plug in, doing outreach to bankers and financial lenders about regenerative grazing so that they're have a better understanding of what farmers are, what the possibilities are for farmers and would be more likely to provide capital. We also would like to see some financial incentives, whether it's through cost share or through grant programs, through NRCS or Illinois Department of Ag, to incentivize landowners and farmers to transition their operations to include regenerative grazing. We'd like to see financial incentives for small to medium-sized meat processors to help increase capacity for processing in the state. We'd like to see a campaign to promote grazing cover crops amongst grain producers. And the Midwest Grazing Exchange is definitely a part of plugging that, but we need to get the word out there more that it is very profitable and very beneficial to farm operations to graze cover crops. And we'd like to see more of that happening. Recommendation number 8, building awareness among Illinois consumers and end market buyers of the benefits of purchasing Illinois grass-finished beef. A lot of these recommendations are focused on the producer side, but the producers will not be able to succeed if we don't have a market side demanding that product. So we'd like to see some efforts there. And the final recommendation, number 9, form or select an organization to serve as a long-term champion of regenerative grazing in Illinois. And I'm very happy to be able to report that the Illinois Grazing Lands Coalition has stepped forward and become the champion organization for grazing in the state. So they are currently fundraising to hire a grazing organizer position. And that person will take the lead on implementing the work plan of this roadmap and helping coordinate activities across the state to that end. And with that, I will turn the presentation back over to Jane, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks Mallory for setting that kind of big picture context. And so we're going to now kind of focus in on one of those recommendations, in particular around grazing cover crops and facilitating grazing connections through the Midwest Grazing Exchange. So I'm going to just give us a really quick overview of the exchange. I'm going to share my screen here and just give you, how it came to be, and then a little bit of a tutorial on some of the different functionality. Okay, Midwest Grazing Exchange, what is it? It's a free matchmaking service that aims to connect livestock farmers with landowners across a 6-state region in the Midwest. So that's Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. And grazers can search for forage to graze, and landowners can search for livestock to graze their land. Midwest Grazing Exchange launched in 2020 and was co-developed by Practical Farmers of Iowa and the Pasture Project as part of the Midwest Perennial Forage Working Group. And I'll note here, each of the 6 states has a state host, and these are folks that meet regularly and support grazing activities in their respective states. And their contact info is on the Midwest Grazing Exchange website, and they're great people to connect with if you have particular questions about how the grazing exchange works in your state. So the website has a number of different functionalities. It allows users to search listings and has an interactive map with filters for criteria like season, land, and livestock type. You can also create listings yourself, so of listings of what land or livestock you have to offer. And you can create a free account to save listings of interest, see contact information, and message other users. There's also a great list of grazing resources that includes examples of grazing lease agreements and contracts. And then also some just general information about the benefits of regenerative grazing for both landowners and livestock owners. So this is a current snapshot of the listing in the 6-state region that the Midwest Grazing Exchange covers. The orange pins represent livestock and the green pins represent land. You can see Illinois in there has 6 listings, and we'd love to see that number grow. And livestock and land listings come with options to choose from. And so on the right, you can see some of those category filters that you can filter by season, by livestock type, by land type. And there are a couple cool new features on the site. You can now leave reviews on listings. You can get new notifications when new listings are added near you. And you can also share listings to Facebook and Twitter. So we're slowly building this out. So it's a really robust tool to facilitate these grazing connections. There's also a Facebook page that serves as a national grazing exchange directory. So the Midwest Grazing Exchange is not the first or the only grazing exchange. There's a Mountain West Grazing Exchange in South Dakota. And so this Facebook page and also the Midwest Grazing Exchange website is a great place if you're not from one of the 6 states that the Midwest Grazing Exchange covers, a great place to see if there is a grazing exchange that covers your region. And then really quickly, I'm going to just run through the process to create a listing. It's super easy, free. You add name, photo, some information about you, and then you are directed into this form where you complete some information about the type of listing, whether it's a land listing or livestock. And yeah, some description, your location, and then some photos. So super simple process. And then again, all contact information is private unless people have accounts on the site. And then just a couple important reminders, and Brett is going to talk some more about these things. Contracts can help form positive working relationships, and clear communication is a key component of all of this and in making successful matches via the site. So that's kind of a high-level overview of the Grazing Exchange. I'm going to now pass it to someone who's actually used the exchange. So Brett Mathews is a retired U.S. Army veteran who, along with his wife Emily, practices multi-species intensive rotational grazing on a 6th-generation farmstead in Adams County, Illinois. He uses cattle, sheep, hogs, and chickens, along with perennial and annual cover crops, silvopasture, and pollinator mixes to rebuild and regenerate the farm soil and the ecosystem. And Brett and Emily have recently moved away from cash crops to focus on year-round grazing. So I'll hand it to you, Brett.
Better unmute it. How's it going, everybody? So yeah, so I couldn't have said that introduction any better myself. But yeah, it's so we have just to clarify on the last thing, we have decided to just get out of row crops entirely. We don't have the equipment, so we had to custom hire everything. I mean, the planting to the combining and grain hauling. So we just decided to you know, just go full-time regenerative grazing. So I was in the Army for 20 years. I originally from Adams County, moved to Jacksonville, graduated high school there, and joined the Army. And it is a 6th generation farm. The picture on the top right there are my great grandparents. They were the third. My grandpa was the 3rd generation on this farm. My great grandpa, and and that's a barn that his father built right there on the bottom right. So we have a lot of sentimental value to taking care of this land and stewarding it. And so that's what we're trying to do, just to show you where we're situated. You can see there, Quincy is probably the closest quote unquote big city. That's the county seat of Adams County, but we're right there in the west central Illinois, where there are quite a few cows out here. There's more and more confinement operations being built as we speak. If you drive through, you can definitely smell them on a regular basis. And here's just some pictures of some of the cattle that we had last year. What we did was, last year was our first year doing cattle. I was the first in the state of Illinois to sign up for the Midwest Grazing Exchange. I mean, as soon as I heard that the site had gone live, I put in something there. And it wasn't until probably, I think it was like October or something like that of 20, gee whiz, I don't remember what year it was, but it wasn't until January, February until I finally found somebody that we kind of met our needs. But we ended up grazing cow calves. In fact, a lot of the cows were pregnant when we received them. And so the large majority of the calves were born on our pastures. So that's, and you can see right there on the top left is I'm moving them around and controlling them with a single strand of polywire electric fencing. And then the bottom left there, we do have a small flock of sheep. And so you could see the impact that those sheep are doing, like especially in the weedy areas. This was almost all goldenrod. And so we ran the sheep through there, and you could see the impact on that grazing, just to I mean, glean some forage out of the otherwise weeds that somebody would have sprayed or mowed or tilled under. And here's our bread and butter as far as our equipment. I mean, this makes our life so much easier. Joel Salatin talks about new technology, right? I mean, this is something that's been brought up in the last, I mean, the electric fence has been around for quite a while, but using it for livestock and making it portable. You see on this one, I have a 12-volt battery, deep cycle battery power in this one. So it's 100% portable. I don't need to plug it into a wall. And this is a Cyclops brand here, which we tend to favor. They've done really well for us compared to some of the other brands. But I mean, we could string out a couple miles of fence in just a couple hours pretty efficiently with this electric fence. So just to talk about where I get a lot of my like mentorship from, and not directly, but like Greg Judy here. He's an author of a couple books, No Risk Ranching and Comeback Farms. He does grass-fed beef and lamb. Sometimes he actually puts them all in the same paddock together. Most of the time he runs them separate because they have different needs. But what he actually does is he custom grazes. So he grazes other people's livestock on land that he leases. So he doesn't really have, besides the infrastructure, the electric fence and such, he doesn't have a lot invested. He doesn't have the land, and he doesn't have the cat or the livestock to invest in. So that's kind of how I got in it. I was introduced as a landowner, but I'm actually leasing that ground from my parents. So I'm kind of in the same position that Greg Judy was in. I think he's starting to get his own herd now. But I'm also a graduate of the Soil Health Academy that was hosted and developed by these gentlemen in the picture. Dr. Alan Williams, Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, David Brandt, Shane New. There are some other ones. I think I saw August Horseman in this. I think you're involved in it now, I believe, if I've heard things through the grapevine correctly. But they talk about regeneration through biomimicry, and there's so much more. I mean, I could go on. My whole talk could be about what they teach and go on about, but I've learned a lot from them, and they're continuing to update and see things as science kind of comes out, and they're getting more research done. There was an article that I was interviewed for in the Prairie Farmer, and as you see where I've highlighted there, it says with help from a new grazing exchange. And so this article came out early last year, I think February, in Prairie Farmer magazine. And so they said, want better soil to build fences. And so one of the things, the hurdles we're having to overcome is all of our perimeter fences, nearly all of our perimeter fences have been pulled out and pushed into a ditch. And we're having to go back, and that was about 20 years ago. And we're having to go back and rebuild a lot of those so we can effectively graze, and so I can sleep at night. So yeah, the Midwest Grazing Exchange, what it does is connects cattle producers to crop farmers and pasture owners / managers. But I believe that more importantly, it puts livestock back on the ground, something that we've completely gotten away from. I mean, livestock have been divorced from cropland completely, so there's two separate things, and I think it's very important to have livestock at some point on all ground. So just to get back to reconnect with or mimic nature. And so, but like I said earlier, it took a while for me to find somebody that I could connect with to bring their cattle in. So that's why my last bullet there is to be patient and diligent. And I'll cover more about the diligence part here in a little bit. And then when you make a listing, be sure to sell yourself and provide as many details as possible. I've seen some listings that actually cause a person to have to ask a lot of questions, or it's like, well, I don't know enough about that listing, so I'm not even gonna show any, I'm gonna move on, or there's going to be a complete lack of interest. So just make sure that if you set up an account on this, that you provide as many details as possible. Don't just say, oh, I have 10 dry cows, or I have 100 acres of ground to be grazed. Make sure that you say, well, what kind of ground is it? Is it perennial grasses? Is it going to be in cover crops, et cetera, et cetera? So, and like they said earlier, there's that little map on the right, kind of zoomed in from earlier. We have 4 grazing listings in Illinois and 2 that are looking for grazing or pasture. And the ones that say grazing available, there's 2 in particular. One's like 18 acres and the other one's like 15. And so we have a lot of room here in the state of Illinois to expand on this. Especially here in West Central Illinois, there's a lot of ground that gets tied up in CRP, and I think that that's not really a good long-term plan. That's my opinion. All right, so 2 easy win-win scenarios, especially for crop farmers looking to get livestock and maybe earn a little bit more money with their ground. So scenario 1, crop farmer frost seeds clover into winter wheat and grazes the field after the wheat harvest in lieu of your double crop or risky soybeans. We had a local farmer that, and it's interesting, he has cows, and he went double crop beans behind his wheat, and he actually sowed those soybeans, I think July 23rd. And the person sowing those said, I don't think you should do that. And he was kind of stubborn about it and did it anyway. Well, guess what? They got frosted and they were only about 8 or 10 inches tall. And so I don't think he got much out of that. And he probably would have been better off to expand his grazing into that field. But I mean, I think clover, like medium red clover, the last I checked is like $80 for a 50-pound bag. And you could sow that on, let's say 5 pounds an acre, frost seed it in say February or March. And so for $8 an acre plus the time and fuel to spread that out there, you know, you've got maybe $10 or $12 into that clover per acre, and that could give you probably a couple passes with cattle, you know, that summer and fall. So that's an option there. Another one, a crop farmer drills cereal rye right after shelling corn. So chase that combine out of the field with your drill, putting that cereal rye in, and then next spring, before you put your beans in, hopefully you're not going on corn. If you are, I wouldn't put cereal rye in. Anyway, another story. But if you're going into beans, you can graze that cereal rye off and use cattle to terminate that cereal rye before your soybeans go in the ground. All right, so here's a couple pitfalls. Some things that I've run into. Some of you other folks with custom grazing experience may have run into others, but here's what I've found. Watch out for wild cattle and or the ones not trained to hot wire. We had one that we got. The gentleman who brings us cows actually bought a few of them from down south, and I think some of them were range cows, and they had no respect for hot wire whatsoever. We had one we named Karen, and she was actually back to being a range cow for about 2 weeks before we could get her rounded up over in the neighbor's corral. So, and actually the cattle owner felt really bad. He's like, I'm really sorry. He's, I'm sending somebody over to get those cows right, you know, that cow and calf right now. So just watch out for stuff like that and have a contingency. Send the cow packing, and he swapped it out. When he brought his bull, he brought a couple more cows to replace the one that he took. So also make sure you give each other a warm and fuzzy. Get to know each other before making any deals or signing contracts. There was a gentleman, a prospective person who wanted to bring cows in, and he came in and tried to tell me how to do everything, and I already knew that he and I were going to have personality conflicts, and because I told him, you know, draw lines in the sand and don't let people cross those, no matter, you know. I'm just saying, if it's going to end up being a bad situation, just watch out for that. So yeah, before making or signing a contract. The third one there, not having a contract. Those also, I talked earlier about being able to sleep at night. That's something else that give you a lot of peace of mind, and make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music there. And then also watch out for someone who says, I'm always looking for pasture. And here's why. If somebody's always looking for pasture, how do you think that means that they treat the pastures they've already been in? And I'll show you a couple pictures here. They're not ones that I've taken, but there's a family friend, actually my grandpa's friend, lives just down the road, and she has some land in CRP, and she had some pasture in the back that she let some old boys put their cattle on. Well, it ended up looking like a moonscape, and I mean, it was so tore up. And she said, and I'd asked about the pasture up front that was in CRP. I said, well, when's that coming out of CRP? They said 5 years. I said, oh, and they said, well, don't ask, because she's not ever letting anybody graze on her ground again. And so that's the kind of things you want to look out for, especially from a landowner's perspective, because here these pictures are usually what happens when those people say, I'm always looking for pasture. And hopefully none of you have said that. I'm not meaning any offense. I'm just saying from personal experience, the guys that say that usually treat their pastures and they end up looking like this. All right, so contracts. I took a lot of this from the ATRA website. If before the talk is over, if I can remember, I will actually put a link in the comments to this. This talks about doing custom grazing contracts. They could be as simple. I'll show an example after these 2 slides, but they could be really simple. But you know, talks about everything that could come up, that you know, where questions might arise. You know, put these, and the contract doesn't have to be set in stone. Say, dang, you know, I forgot to put this in the contract, or you know, ask if you guys agree, redo the contract. It's not, you know, not that big of a deal. So, but everything should be covered in that contract, just to make sure that there's a clear understanding. So like, what happens in a drought? Are we going to feed hay, or are we going to send the cattle home? You know, when and how often do you get paid? What are you getting paid? You know, per day, you know, by weight, you know, number of head, etc. And who, you know, who's buying the supplement and minerals, the salt, etc. All right, and then I'm not going to go through all these line by line, but you guys can kind of scan over them. But it's just, you know, defining and clarifying everything that may come up with these contracts, and you know, especially if things go bad, cow gets sick, calf dies, something like that. All right, so here's just an example here. And you know, it's obviously it's not exhausting, but it is it's a good start. Having something is better than nothing. And so like I said, if somebody forgot something or wants to add something to the contract and you both agree, draw it back up and sign it. Both of you sign it, and you know, each one of you have a copy. Just want to make sure. I mean, I think we live in the age of litigation, so we just need to you know, try to cover our backs as much as possible. All right, so one thing I didn't cover before I get into questions was the profit potential. I spoke at a grain producers conference, organic grain producers conference out in Champaign a little over a month ago, and I said, I'm never going to be able to convince you guys getting $30 a bushel for soybeans to convert land to perennial pastures, especially you know, right now. And so but I got to reading in the Illinois Farm Bureau publication Farm Week, and it said because inputs are so stinking high right now that nobody's making more money because these grain prices are so high. So it's still the same amount of income because of those inputs. And so I mean, there's some ground, especially here in Western Illinois, probably down in Southern Illinois, that probably has no business being tilled up or in row crop acres. And those, I think, are prime candidates for converting to perennial pastures, especially when half the field ends up washing into the river, you know, in a heavy rainstorm. So here is my contact information for those of you that have questions after this presentation or this meeting. That's email and my phone number, and then you can look us up on our Facebook page. We're not super active on the Facebook page. It's just one thing that kind of slips through our fingers when we're super busy. So, but feel free to take that down or take a little picture or screenshot or however you're taking this presentation. So, and then I think we're moving on to questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brett. That was great. Lots of good tips for how to make this work. And like I said, there are a lot of those, like that ATRA fact sheet, a lot of those contract resources are on the Midwest Grazing Exchange website, but we'll also make sure to link to those when we post the recording. So we've got some time now, about 10 minutes for questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can also just unmute and ask your questions directly. And there was a question a while back for you, Brett, about that battery for your portable fence. How long does the battery stay charged? And have you experimented at all with solar?
Yeah, so that battery lasts me probably a good week. I can kind of tell by the way the Energizer starts getting a little weak. I could tell, but yeah, usually 5 to 7 days I can get out of that one battery, and that's a deep cycle battery. So it's like, you know, what they use for trolling motors and stuff like that. The battery itself, I think I got those at Menards for 70 or 80 bucks a piece. Now, if I wanted to get into solar, it would, I think, complicate things and make it less portable. We tried a solar energizer. I don't remember the brand, Stafix, I believe, and the thing was just weak. It didn't put out hardly any snap whatsoever. I think so that Cyclops that I showed in the picture is 2.5 joules, and the Stafix, the Energizer, and we paid about the same amount of money for the Stafix and the Cyclops. It put out like 0.1 joules or something like that. And so the animals, especially the sheep, did not respect that wire at all. It didn't pack the punch that we needed.
Great, thanks. A question in here about contract grazing rates, and I know Pete dropped a good article. There are some other resources on the website. I'm wondering, Brett, what process you took to kind of set pasture rental rates for your farm?
I didn't really. I looked up some averages like nationwide, but I mean, everything changes, and that's not actually one of those things that is publicized a lot. There are some ways to do it. It's based on land costs and stuff like that. And I actually, the guy that I brought his cows in, I shot him a number, and I knew it was a little low. And I said, I'm doing this because you're taking a chance on me. And he said, well, it's about right. If I were just to go out and rent pasture, it was about the same as he could have rented pasture for, but he was actually getting, you know, my services in addition. So I'm probably on the low side. Actually, I know I am. And so, I mean, things are negotiable, obviously, but I think also on the ATRA contract, and I'm going to find that, but on that ATRA publication, it actually tells you how to figure that out or gives you some guidelines.
Great. And I know Pete also dropped what looks like a calculator tool in here too. So lots of resources to do that. There's another question in the chat here about beginning farmers looking to build enterprise budgets for FSA loans. I don't think we do have any resources currently on the exchange around that particular topic. But if folks have recommendations, feel free to throw those in the chat, and we can also do some. That's a great suggestion for a resource to add, so we can do some research on our end. Here's another question for you, Brett. What type of perimeter fence do you recommend?
Well, I'm sorry, I thought I was muted. So no, it just depends on your livestock, and it depends on what the perimeter is bordering. I mean, if you're along a busy highway, you would definitely probably want to overbuild that fence quite a bit. But if you're just like along a back country gravel road, you could probably go with a 3 or 4 strand high tensile electric fence, and that would be adequate. But like our end goal, especially because we're along Highway 104, is to have woven wire up along that highway, and then we have a gravel road on the west side that we're going to do a 4 strand high tensile as a permanent fence, perimeter fence.
Cool, thanks. Another question here from Wendy, what are some safeguards that Midwest Grazing Exchange has in place to ensure runners and graziers receive payment for services? Pete or others on my team, feel free to jump in. I think the critical part of this is what goes into that contract. So Midwest Grazing Exchange largely is served to provide a tool for people to kind of see and find each other, but those legal safeguards are what would need to come through in a contract. But feel free to jump in, Pete or others.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a few more words on that, Jane. Appreciate it. So we try to stay out of that direct contracting relationship on the exchange because it's just not our role, and it would be really complicated and probably get us in a lot of hot water. And so we try to just encourage folks, as Jane mentioned, as Brett emphasized, just really making sure that you know each other, work out the details, and be willing to write it down and then rewrite it as it needs to as things evolve. The thing that we've done as a safeguard on the exchange is implement that review system, and it's kind of a new feature, so it's getting going. And we just see that as a little bit of community accountability, where if somebody is a bad actor on the exchange and they're not doing right by folks as they're moving around, you're going to see those reviews show up on the exchange. And that's where, just to reinforce, taking a look, leaving positive reviews, leaving constructive reviews, and then also, as Brett mentioned, just getting to know somebody is probably the best safeguard, because you'll know, just as Brett mentioned, when you talk to somebody, you're going to know if you want to shake their hand or not. And to try to do that before they show up with a trailer full of animals is usually a good idea.
Thanks, Pete. And I think that answers another question in here, which is there a rating feature? And there is a new feature on the site. There is a feature where you can leave reviews and ratings. I'm seeing another really good question in here from Helen about whether there's any action to quantify the nutrient loss reduction impacts of regenerative grazing and get regenerative grazing as an improved practice in the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy. And I'm wondering, Mallory, if you have any thoughts on that, or Pete?
I'm more than happy to say a few words there. We haven't done that exact calculation, but with that 40,000 acre goal that Mallory did such a great job highlighting in the roadmap, you can figure out what good managed pasture means on 40,000 acres. So you can do the quantifications and figure out what does it actually mean in terms of pounds of phosphorus or sediment loss reduction. So it certainly is doable within there. And we certainly do want to see better inclusion of good grazing in all state nutrient loss reduction strategies. They're not all created equal, as so many folks might know. Some places have it in there to greater degrees, other states don't. And it's really about working on a state by state level with the technical board, the science board that sits behind those strategies to try to get better practices. So yes, we'd love to see it, and we certainly are working towards that. But it's a big job that requires a lot of hands.
Yeah, and I would just to add on, I would also like the NRCS to kind of enter in regenerative grazing as a carbon sequestration, what do they call it, enhancement or whatever. And because there was a program I signed up for called the Conservation Stewardship Program, and one of the enhancements on there was carbon sequestration. Well, what do you think that was? It had nothing to do with grasslands. It involved planting trees. And although I think that does sequester carbon, I don't think it does it as quickly as good regenerative grazing does.
Mallory, did you have anything to add on that question about nutrient loss? Cool. Well, we're about at time here. Any final thoughts from either of our presenters? Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, I'll just add just a call to action. The link to the regenerative grazing roadmap for Illinois was shared through the chat. I strongly encourage everybody to download it and take a look at where you think you could possibly plug in, and reach out to any of those organizations that are listed as authors on the event or on the roadmap to see if there are ways that you could plug in and help drive forward the adoption of regenerative grazing in the state.
Awesome. And I'll add, I know there's some folks on the call who are not from Illinois. If you're not from Illinois, don't fear. Feel free to, lots of good grazing work happening across the Midwest. And the state exchange hosts are great people who are all active in grazing in their respective states. And you can also reach out to us if you want to get more plugged in on grazing work happening across the Midwest. So thanks everyone for attending. Special thanks to Mallory and Brett for great presentations. Just a note, once I end the call here, your browser will automatically open a post-webinar survey. And that's a great chance to give us some feedback on this webinar. And if you have suggestions for future webinars, you know, drilling in more of the details of contract grazing, anything related to the work that we do, please let us know. And we'll share the recording out with all of the resources that were mentioned, hopefully next week. So thanks everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.
Take care.